The air hung thick with Indiana humidity on the evening of April 5, 1944, when Lieutenant Roger Terry stood outside the Officers Club at Freeman Field and made a decision that would change his life. The building before him was nothing special, just a simple wooden structure with light spilling from its windows, the sound of laughter and clinking glasses drifting out into the warm spring air. Inside, white officers relaxed after a day of training, drinking beer, playing cards, doing what officers did. It was ordinary, unremarkable, and completely off limits to Roger Terry, despite the silver bars on his shoulders and the wings pinned to his chest. Terry had been born in Lafayette, Louisiana in 1921, into a world that had very clear ideas about where black people belonged. His father worked as a Pullman porter, serving white passengers who treated him as furniture. His mother took in laundry, her hands perpetually raw from lye soap. They lived in the colored section of town, drank from colored water fountains, and understood that stepping outside these boundaries could result in anything from humiliation to death. The rules were never written in any book, but they were everywhere. In the signs that said white only and colored, in the separate entrances to movie theaters, in the understanding that certain sidewalks required stepping aside when white people approached, in 1,000 daily humiliations that taught black children they were less than. But Roger's father had maintained something precious, his sense of self-worth. He'd told Roger once, "They can make you use the back door, son. They can make you step aside, but they can't make you believe you belong there. That's yours. Don't give that away." Roger had held on to those words through high school, through the limited opportunities available to a black boy in Louisiana. College seemed impossible. Professional careers were closed. The ceiling was low and visible. Then came Pearl Harbor. America needed soldiers. Roger had a choice: wait to be drafted into a labor battalion or volunteer for something different. He'd heard about the Army Air Corps opening its pilot training program to Negroes. It was segregated, training at Tuskegee in Alabama, far from white cadets. But it was flying. It was a chance to do something that white America insisted black men couldn't do. He enlisted in August 1942. His mother wept from fear. His father shook his hand and said nothing. Basic training at Tuskegee was brutal. The white officers running the program assumed most black cadets would wash out, would prove that Negroes lacked the intelligence to fly. The training was deliberately harsh, designed to manufacture failure. Roger discovered he was good at flying. The mechanics made sense to him. The relationship between stick and rudder, the feel of the aircraft responding to his inputs, the way altitude and airspeed combined to produce specific results. He loved the precision required, the way sloppiness could kill you, the absolute clarity of cause and effect. In the air, performance mattered. Either you could fly or you couldn't. There was no room for the social hierarchies that governed life on the ground. He graduated in March 1943, earning his wings and commission as second lieutenant. The ceremony was segregated. No white cadets, no white families in the audience, just black pilots and their black families, and the few white officers assigned to oversee the program. But Roger wore his wings with pride. He'd earned them. He'd proven something, not just to the white doubters, but to himself. His first assignment was to the 477th Bombardment Group, the first black bomber unit in American military history. The Army Air Forces, facing massive pilot shortages as the air war in Europe intensified, had decided to expand the Tuskegee experiment beyond fighters. Black pilots would fly B-25 Mitchell bombers, medium bombers that required not just a pilot, but an entire crew: co-pilot, bombardier, navigator, gunners. In March 1944, the 477th transferred to Freeman Field in Indiana. The base sat in flat farmland, a collection of runways and hangars that appeared suddenly among cornfields. It had been established as a training facility, with adequate runways but minimal amenities. And Freeman Field had a problem. It had white instructors and black trainees, and someone had to decide how they would coexist. Colonel Robert Selway, the base commander, solved this through segregation. He designated the Officers Club as off-limits to trainee personnel, which happened to include all the black officers. A new club would be established for them eventually. In the meantime, the existing club was for instructors only. It was a lie that didn't even pretend to be believable. Everyone understood what was happening. This wasn't about training status. This was about race. This was about ensuring that even in uniform, even when holding the same rank, black officers would be kept separate, would be reminded that their commissions came with asterisks and limitations. For the first few weeks, most black officers swallowed their anger and focused on training. They were here to learn to fly B-25s in combat formation, to practice bombing runs and navigation, to prepare for deployment to the war. The club seemed like a small thing, a petty indignity in the larger scheme. And there was risk in challenging it. The military could make life very difficult for officers who caused trouble. Court-martial, bad efficiency reports, assignment to dead-end positions. The message was clear. Shut up and be grateful you're allowed to fly at all. But the exclusion gnawed at Roger Terry. It wasn't about wanting to drink beer or play cards. It was about what the exclusion meant, what it said about how the military viewed him and every other black officer. They were good enough to die for their country. The Army would happily send them into combat, but not good enough to share room with white officers. The uniform meant something different depending on who wore it. He talked about it with other black officers, carefully at first, testing the waters. Some agreed it was wrong, but counseled patience. Pick your battles, they said. We're making progress just by being here. Don't risk it over something symbolic. Others were angrier, wanted to act, but weren't sure what action would accomplish besides getting them in trouble. Lieutenant Coleman Young, a navigator from Detroit with a sharp tongue and sharper political instincts, was most vocal. They can't court-martial all of us, he argued. There's a war on. They need pilots. If enough of us push back, if we make this visible, they'll have to choose between maintaining segregation and maintaining the war effort. We have leverage if we use it. Roger wasn't sure Young was right about the leverage. The military had shown considerable creativity in maintaining segregation despite wartime pressures, but he was right that collective action was the only action that mattered. One officer trying to enter the club would be dealt with quietly, but a group, a coordinated effort, that would be harder to suppress. They made plans, nothing elaborate. They simply agreed they would attempt to enter the club in groups peacefully. If denied, they would request denial in writing. If threatened with arrest, they would comply without resistance. Just a clear, documented challenge to the segregation policy. April 5th, 1944. Evening. Roger Terry stood outside with Coleman Young and Lieutenant Leroy Battle. All three wore dress uniforms, perfectly pressed, their insignia properly placed. "Ready?" Young asked. Terry nodded. His heart pounded, but his hands were steady. He'd been trained to control fear, to function under pressure. They walked to the entrance. The door was opened by a white lieutenant whose face registered surprise and then hardened. "Can I help you?" "We're here to use the club," Terry said. "Officers' club. This facility is for instructor personnel only. You'll need to use the trainee facility." "There is no trainee facility," Young said. "Where exactly are we supposed to go?" The white lieutenant's jaw tightened. "That's not my concern. You are not authorized to enter this club. That's a direct order." "Sir," Terry said, keeping his voice level, "I'm a commissioned officer. This is the officers' club. I respectfully submit that I am authorized to enter." "You are ordered not to enter. If you attempt to enter, you will be arrested." This was the moment, the point of no return. Terry could walk away, could accept the order, could tell himself he'd made his point, or he could push forward, could force the confrontation, could make the military choose between its segregation policy and its own regulations. Roger Terry stepped through the doorway. "You're under arrest," the white lieutenant said, almost shouting. "Military police!" Two MPs appeared with remarkable speed, suggesting they'd been positioned nearby, waiting. They weren't rough. Terry was an officer after all, but they were firm. "Sir, you need to come with us." Terry didn't resist. He maintained his military bearing, his dignity. Behind him, Young's voice. "Arrest me too, then. I'm coming in." And Battle. "Me too." By the time Terry reached the provost marshal's office, all three were under arrest. The charge, disobeying a direct order. In wartime, that was serious. That could mean prison. But Roger Terry felt something unexpected: relief. The pretense was over. The careful dance of maintaining that this was somehow legitimate, that the club policy was about training and not race, all of it was exposed. He'd been arrested for trying to enter a building his rank entitled him to enter. The military would have to explain that. Word spread through the black officers' quarters within the hour. Terry had done it. He'd walked into the club, and he'd been arrested for it. The next evening, more came. Not 3 officers, dozens. Not everyone came the second night. Some of the black officers at Freeman Field counseled caution, argued that Terry's arrest proved the futility of direct confrontation, insisted that patience and professionalism were the better path. "We're making history just by being here," one senior officer said. "Why risk everything over a club we don't even need?" But others saw it differently. Lieutenant Coleman Young, released from arrest along with Terry in battle after a night in confinement, understood that Terry's action had created an opportunity. "They arrested us for trying to use our own club," he said to the assembled black officers in their segregated barracks. That's the story. Not that we were insubordinate, not that we were troublemakers, that we were arrested for being black officers who thought our rank meant something. The second night, April 6th, 20 officers approached the club. Not tentatively, not apologetically, but with the deliberate formality of men exercising what they believed to be their rights. They walked in groups of 3 and 4, spaced out over an hour, each group attempting to enter, each being denied, each group calmly requesting written documentation of the denial, each being arrested when they persisted. The military police seemed overwhelmed. They'd prepared for maybe a handful of troublemakers, not a coordinated action involving dozens of officers. The provost marshal's office filled with arrested men, all maintaining perfect military courtesy, all refusing to sign statements acknowledging they understood they weren't permitted in the club. By midnight, 23 black officers were under arrest. The next night, 37 more came. Then 41. The base stockade couldn't hold them all. Officers were confined to their quarters under guard, a surreal situation where trained pilots, men who would soon be expected to fly combat missions, were being treated like criminals for attempting to have a beer in their own officers' club. Colonel Robert Selway watched his command spiraling into chaos. He'd expected the club policy to generate some grumbling, maybe an isolated incident or two. He had not expected mass resistance. He had not expected black officers to coordinate their actions, to support each other, to maintain discipline while fundamentally challenging his authority. Selway was a career officer, a white man from North Carolina who had absorbed the South's racial attitudes without question. He genuinely believed that mixing black and white officers socially would damage morale and discipline. The club policy, from his perspective, wasn't about racism. It was about maintaining good order. Blacks and whites were simply different, had different cultures and preferences, and keeping them separate was just practical management. But the arrests were making that position untenable. How do you explain to the War Department that you've arrested over 60 officers for trying to use their own club? How do you maintain that this is about training status when every single trainee is black and every single instructor is white? The fig leaf was transparent, and the black officers' coordinated action was forcing everyone to acknowledge it. On April 9th, Selway issued what became known as Base Regulation 85-2, a formal written order that designated the Officers Club as off-limits to all personnel except those specifically authorized as instructor officers. He then ordered every officer on base to sign a statement acknowledging they had read and understood the regulation. This was Selway's attempt to transform an unwritten practice into official policy, to create a legal framework that would allow him to court-martial anyone who violated the order. If the black officers signed, they would be acknowledging in writing that they understood they were excluded from the club. If they refused to sign, they would be directly disobeying a written order, which was clear grounds for court-martial. Roger Terry read the regulation in his quarters, where he was still confined following his arrest. The language was bureaucratic, carefully neutral, making no explicit mention of race. But everyone understood what it meant. Signing this paper meant accepting segregation. It meant agreeing that the military could treat black officers differently than white officers. It meant validating the entire system of exclusion. He thought about his father, who had spent decades signing metaphorical papers like this, accepting the boundaries white society imposed, swallowing his dignity to keep his job and feed his family. His father had made those compromises because he had no choice, because resistance meant poverty and possibly violence. But Roger was in a different position. He had leverage. The military needed pilots. And he had brothers, dozens of other black officers who were as angry as he was, as willing to resist. When the officer came to collect signed acknowledgments, Terry refused. "I will not sign a document that codifies discrimination," he said. "Court-martial me if you want, but I won't validate this policy with my signature." The officer making the rounds was a young white lieutenant who looked uncomfortable. "Sir, I'm just following orders. Everyone has to sign. If you refuse, it goes in your record as disobeying a direct order." "Then that's what it is," Terry said. He wasn't alone. Throughout the black officers' quarters, the same scene played out. Some officers signed, calculating that a signature was a tactical retreat, that preserving their careers would allow them to fight other battles. No one judged them. The pressure was immense, and everyone understood that resistance carried real costs. But 101 officers refused to sign. 101 black officers, many of them fresh from training, some with families depending on them, all facing potential court-martial and prison time, said no. They would not acknowledge in writing that segregation was legitimate. They would not participate in their own exclusion. The number stunned Selway. He'd expected maybe a dozen holdouts, troublemakers he could isolate and punish. But 101 officers? That was almost the entire complement of black officers on base. That was a rebellion, or at least something that could be portrayed as one. And in wartime, military rebellion was potentially a capital offense. But the reality was more complicated. These weren't mutineers. They were officers who had followed every regulation, completed every training requirement, maintained military discipline in every way except this one. They refused to accept that their rank meant less because of their skin color. They weren't refusing to fly. They weren't refusing to fight. They were refusing to accept second-class status. The War Department in Washington received reports of the situation at Freeman Field with alarm. This was exactly the kind of racial incident the military had hoped to avoid. The Army was already facing criticism from civil rights organizations about its treatment of black soldiers. The black press was covering stories about discrimination in uniform. Eleanor Roosevelt had made pointed comments about the military's segregation policies. And now there were over 100 black officers under some form of arrest at a single base, all because they wanted to use their officers' club. The political calculations were complex. The military command was overwhelmingly white and largely sympathetic to segregation. Many senior officers genuinely believed that racial mixing damaged unit cohesion, that black and white soldiers couldn't fight effectively together. But there was also a war to win, and that required keeping domestic political conflicts from undermining the war effort. Philip Randolph, the black labor leader who had threatened to march on Washington in 1941 unless the defense industry was desegregated, was watching Freeman Field closely. The WWII was preparing legal briefs. Black newspapers were demanding explanations. This was becoming a public relations disaster. Inside Freeman Field, the black officers under arrest maintained their discipline. They didn't complain, didn't make demands, didn't give Selway any excuse to charge them with actual insubordination. They simply refused to sign the regulation, refused to accept that their exclusion from the club was legitimate, and waited to see what the military would do. The waiting was its own form of torture. These were men trained for action, for flying, for the adrenaline of combat. Sitting in quarters under guard, uncertain whether they would face court-martial or be quietly released, not knowing if their military careers were over. That uncertainty was harder than combat would have been. Lieutenant James Warren, a bombardier from Chicago who had refused to sign, wrote in his diary, "We are in a strange war. We volunteered to fight fascism abroad, and now we are fighting it at home, in our own military. The Germans and Japanese, at least, are honest enemies. But this, being told we are officers and then being treated as something less, this is a different kind of battle. I don't know if we can win it, but I know we can't surrender. Roger Terry spent his time under confinement thinking about what came next. The best-case scenario was that the charges would be quietly dropped, that the military would decide prosecution wasn't worth the political cost. The worst case was court-martial, prison time, dishonorable discharge. There were scenarios in between: administrative punishment, bad efficiency reports, assignment to dead-end positions where they could be sidelined and forgotten. What seemed unlikely was that anything would fundamentally change. Even if they won this battle, even if the club policy was revised, the military would remain segregated. Black soldiers would still be in separate units, still face discrimination in housing and assignments, still be treated as somehow less than white soldiers. Freeman Field was one fight in a much larger war. But it was a fight worth having. Because accepting the club policy meant accepting the logic behind it. That black officers were fundamentally different, fundamentally less deserving of respect, fundamentally outside the community of equals that rank was supposed to create. And if they accepted that here, in the military, where rank and merit were supposed to matter more than race, then where would they not accept it? On April 13th, 8 days after the first officers had been arrested, the military made its decision. The charges against most of the arrested officers were dropped. No courts-martial, no formal punishment. The men were released from confinement and returned to duty. But there was a catch. 3 officers, Roger Terry, Coleman Young, and Marsden Thompson, were singled out for continued prosecution. They would face court-martial for disobeying direct orders when they initially entered the club. The military was sacrificing 3 to avoid the spectacle of trying 101, hoping that limited punishment would satisfy those demanding accountability while avoiding the public relations nightmare of mass trials. Terry received the news with a strange mixture of relief and resignation. Relief that most of his fellow officers were free. Resignation that he would be the example, the warning to others about what happened when you challenged the system too directly. The court-martial of Roger Terry began on June 7, 1945, more than 2 months after he had walked through the door of the Officers' Club. By then, the war in Europe had ended. Hitler was dead, Germany had surrendered, and American troops were celebrating victory. The Pacific War continued, but everyone knew it was only a matter of time. The world had moved on from the crisis that had seemed so urgent in April. But Terry's trial proceeded anyway, a reminder that some battles outlasted the wars that spawned them. The charges were specific: disobeying a direct order from a superior officer. The evidence was clear. He had been ordered not to enter the club, and he had entered anyway. The defense would have to argue not that he hadn't disobeyed, but that the order itself was unlawful. The courtroom was a small space in a building on base, nothing formal or impressive. A table for the prosecution, a table for the defense, a raised platform for the 3 officers who would serve as judges. Terry sat in his dress uniform, his posture military perfect, his expression neutral. He'd learned long ago not to let white people see what he was feeling. The prosecutor was a white captain who seemed uncomfortable with the case. He presented the facts mechanically. On April 5, 1944, Lieutenant Terry had been ordered not to enter the Officers' Club. He had entered anyway. That constituted disobedience of a direct order. The prosecution rested after 20 minutes. The defense attorney, a white major from the Judge Advocate General's Corps who had been assigned to the case, stood and asked the court for permission to present evidence about the context of the order. "The issue before this court," he said, "is not simply whether Lieutenant Terry disobeyed an order, but whether the order he disobeyed was itself lawful under military regulations governing the treatment of officers." The lead judge, a white colonel, frowned. "The lawfulness of the order is not at issue here. The order was given by a superior officer. That makes it presumptively lawful. The defendant had a duty to obey." "With respect, sir," the defense attorney said, Army regulations specifically prohibit discrimination based on race in the assignment of facilities. The club policy at Freeman Field violated those regulations. An order that requires an officer to comply with an unlawful policy is itself unlawful. The argument went back and forth for an hour. The prosecution insisted that club assignments were within the base commander's discretion, that Colonel Selway had the authority to designate facilities for specific purposes, that Terry had no right to question a direct order. The defense countered that the designation was a transparent attempt to circumvent anti-discrimination regulations, that the military's own rules were being violated. Roger Terry listened to his own life being discussed in the abstract language of military law. The personal had become procedural. His anger, his dignity, his refusal to accept humiliation, all of it was being translated into questions of regulatory authority and command discretion. The trial lasted 2 days. On June 9th, the verdict came: guilty. The sentence? A reprimand. Not prison, not dishonorable discharge, just a formal reprimand to be placed in his personnel file. It was the minimum possible punishment, a signal that the court understood the complicated politics of the case, that they were checking a box without enthusiasm. Terry felt nothing when the verdict was read. He'd expected it. You don't challenge power and expect power to admit it was wrong. The system protects itself, always. But something else happened that mattered more than the verdict. The NAACP, which had been monitoring the Freeman Field situation, filed a formal complaint with the War Department. Thurgood Marshall, the organization's chief legal counsel, who would later become the first black Supreme Court justice, wrote a lengthy brief documenting the discrimination at Freeman Field and arguing that the military's segregation policies violated the Constitution. The complaint went nowhere immediately. The War Department defended its policies, insisted that segregation was necessary for military efficiency, claimed that integration would damage morale. But the complaint became part of a growing file of evidence that would eventually force change. Meanwhile, the 477th Bombardment Group never saw combat. The war ended before they could deploy. All that training, all that preparation, and they never got to prove what they could do. Some saw this as the final insult. They'd been good enough to face court-martial, but not good enough to fight. Roger Terry saw it differently. They had fought, just not the enemy they'd expected. The military began demobilizing in late 1945. The massive wartime force was being reduced to a peacetime skeleton. Officers were being discharged by the thousands. Terry received his discharge papers in November 1945, 18 months after he'd walked into that club. He returned to Louisiana, to a state that had not changed in his absence. The same segregation, the same exclusion, the same understanding that black people, regardless of their service, regardless of their uniforms, were still second-class citizens. He got a job at the post office, a federal job that offered some protection from the worst of Jim Crow's economic discrimination. He married, had children, built a life. On the surface, it looked like he'd accepted the boundaries that Southern society imposed, but something had changed in him that couldn't be changed back. He'd walked through that door. He'd stood up to power. He'd discovered that resistance was possible, that collective action could force institutions to show their true nature, that even when you lost, the act of fighting mattered. He became active in his local NAACP chapter. He registered black voters, knowing that each registration was an act of defiance against a system that relied on black disenfranchisement. He attended meetings, planned boycotts, supported the slow, dangerous work of challenging segregation in Louisiana. His children asked him about the war. He told them about flying, about training, about the technical aspects of piloting a B-25. He didn't talk much about Freeman Field. How do you explain to children that you were arrested for trying to have a beer? How do you make them understand that the small act of walking through a door carried the weight of history? But when the civil rights movement exploded in the 1950s and 1960s, when his daughter wanted to participate in a sit-in at a segregated lunch counter in Baton Rouge, he didn't try to stop her. He told her about Freeman Field, about the club, about the arrests, about the principle that some doors need to be open not because of what's behind them, but because closing them is a denial of humanity. "We didn't win," he told her. They court-martialed me. The policy didn't change, but we made them show their hand. We made them arrest over 100 officers for wanting to be treated like officers, and that mattered. It became part of the record, part of the evidence that the system was unjust. His daughter went to the sit-in. She was arrested, just as he had been 20 years earlier, and when she called him from jail, scared and uncertain, he told her he was proud of her. "You're doing what I did," he said. "You're refusing to accept the lie that you're less than human. Keep doing it. It's the only way things change." The military formally desegregated in 1948 when President Truman issued Executive Order 9981. The order didn't mention Freeman Field, didn't acknowledge the role that the resistance there had played in forcing change. But the connections were real. The Freeman Field Mutiny, as it came to be called, was part of the pressure that made segregation in the military untenable. The men who had refused to sign Selway's regulation became heroes to later generations of black military officers. They'd stood up when standing up could have ended their careers. They'd risked everything for a principle. That rank should matter more than race, that officers should be treated as officers regardless of skin color. Coleman Young, one of the 3 officers court-martialed alongside Terry, went on to become the first black mayor of Detroit, serving from 1974 to 1994. He spoke often about Freeman Field, about how that experience taught him that resistance was possible, that challenging unjust authority was a duty, not a crime. The 101 officers who refused to sign became known as the Freeman Field 101, honored in black military history as men who had put their careers on the line for dignity. Their names were recorded, their actions documented, their resistance remembered as part of the long struggle against military segregation. Roger Terry never achieved the prominence that Young did. He lived his life in Louisiana, working at the post office, raising his family, participating quietly in the civil rights movement. But he carried Freeman Field with him always. It was his reference point, his proof that he had stood up, that he had refused to accept injustice even when acceptance would have been easier. In 1970, a historian researching the desegregation of the military found Terry and interviewed him. The interview lasted 4 hours. Terry, by then 50 years old, spoke carefully about what had happened at Freeman Field, choosing his words with the precision of someone who understood that history could be distorted, that resistance could be forgotten or minimized. "We didn't think we were making history," he said. "We just thought we were being treated unfairly, and we decided not to accept it. The club itself didn't matter. Nobody cared about drinking beer in that particular room. What mattered was the principle. They were telling us that our rank, our training, our service, none of it outweighed the color of our skin. We couldn't accept that, so we didn't." The historian asked if the court-martial had been worth it. Terry was quiet for a long moment. "Worth it?" he finally said. "I don't know how to measure that. I was found guilty. The policy didn't change immediately. Most people never heard about what we did. But I know this, I didn't accept humiliation. I stood up, and 100 other men stood up with me. That matters. Maybe not in ways that show up in history books, but it matters." In 1995, the Air Force, recognizing the injustice of what had happened at Freeman Field, announced that the court-martial convictions of Terry, Young, and Thompson were being set aside. The records were cleared. Officially, they had not disobeyed orders. Officially, they had been right to challenge the club policy. Roger Terry was 74 years old when he received notification that his conviction had been overturned. He held the letter in his hands, the same hands that had gripped the controls of a B-25, that had saluted superior officers, that had refused to sign Selway's regulation, and he cried. Not from relief, not from vindication, but from the weight of finally being told, officially, by the institution that had punished him, that he had been right, that his resistance had been justified, that walking through that door had mattered. He died 3 years later, in 1998, at the age of 77. His obituary in the local paper mentioned his military service, his work at the post office, his family. It did not mention Freeman Field. That story remained obscure, known primarily to military historians and to the descendants of the men who had participated. But the story persisted, because it needed to. because it was evidence of something essential, that resistance to injustice is always possible, even in the most hierarchical, authoritarian institutions. That collective action can force change, even when that change comes slowly and incompletely. That dignity cannot be granted, it must be claimed. The Officers' Club at Freeman Field was demolished decades ago. The base itself was deactivated, converted to civilian use. There is no memorial to what happened there in April 1945, no historical marker explaining that over 100 black officers were arrested for trying to use their own club. No acknowledgement that one of the early battles of the civil rights movement was fought not in the streets of the South, but on a military base in Indiana. But the Freeman Field 101 are remembered by those who know to look for them. Their story is taught in some military history courses, included in some civil rights curricula, passed down through families whose ancestors participated. And the principle they fought for, that all people, regardless of race, deserve to be treated with full human dignity, that institutions must live up to their stated values or be challenged. That principle remains as urgent now as it was in 1945. Roger Terry walked through a door. 100 other men refused to sign a paper. They were punished for it. And 50 years later, they were vindicated. But the real victory wasn't the vindication. It was the refusal. The decision to stand up even when standing up meant punishment. The choice to claim dignity even when dignity was denied. This is the story of Freeman Field. This is the story of what happened when black officers refused to accept second-class status. This is the story of resistance in uniform. This is American history, the complicated, uncomfortable, necessary truth of it. The struggle continues. The doors are different now, the forms of exclusion more subtle, but the work of walking through closed doors, of demanding equality, of refusing to accept injustice, that work remains. The Freeman Field 101 showed us it's possible. They showed us it matters. They showed us that freedom has never been free, that it has always required people willing to pay the price of resistance. Remember their names, remember their courage. Remember that every expansion of freedom in American history has required someone to push, to demand, to refuse to accept the boundaries that society tried to impose. Roger Terry walked through a door on April 5, 1945. That simple act of resistance rippled forward through time, connecting to the sit-ins and freedom rides and marches that would come later, contributing to the slow, painful, necessary work of making America live up to its founding promise. The Officers' Club is gone. Most of the men who participated are gone, but the principle survives, the idea that all people deserve dignity. The idea that unjust orders must be challenged. The idea that resistance, even when it fails in the moment, plants seeds for future victories. This is the legacy of Freeman Field. This is why the story matters. This is why we must remember.